everyone, and welcome to our webinar this morning. I want to apologize for those who attempted to attend last weekend, and we had to cancel that due to an error in our webinar system. So we apologize for that. We're glad you could return this week, and we're happy to be able to present to you today. So if you're new to our webinar series, welcome and thank you for joining us. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year, and we're glad you could be a part of this one. Today, we're presenting the webinar entitled Maximizing the Value of Literature Reviews in Pharma from Competitive Intelligence to Market Success. Before we get started, I'd like to mention just a few housekeeping items for everyone. First, if you experience any technical difficulties, as I've said, please use the chat option in the Zoom menu or send us a message and we'll do our best to work with you to resolve that. You can enable audio transcription for the webinar today by clicking the captions button and show captions. A full transcript can also be enabled so that you can follow along with our presenter throughout the presentation. If you have any questions about our content today, you don't have to wait until the end. There's a Q&A option in the Zoom menu bar. Send your questions at any point during the presentation and we will run through them at the end as we have time. We also have questions that were submitted during registration, so we will be running through those at the beginning of the question session. If we don't get to your question, we'll be in touch with you later by email. Throughout the webinar, we'll also be sharing important resources and links in the chat for all of our attendees to access, like other related webinars or information sources. The webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch on our website afterwards. You will also receive an email with a link to the recording and the slides. Lastly, I encourage everyone here to take a short survey once the webinar ends. Your feedback helps us create content that matters to you. We're glad you joined us for our live webinar day with Sarah and Sarai. Sarah, okay, we're on the next slide. Let me talk about our first presenter today, Dr. Sarai Paula. Dr. Paula is an accomplished regulatory and medical writer with over 15 years of experience supporting medical device, pharmaceutical, and biologic companies worldwide. As a principal medical writer at Criterion Edge, she develops high-quality content, compliant clinical and regulatory documents across a broad range of therapeutic areas. As a trained medical doctor with multilingual fluency, Dr. Paula brings deep clinical insight and strong communication skills to every project. Her expertise helps clients navigate complex regulatory requirements with clarity, precision, and confidence. Next slide, Sarah. Our second presenter today is Dr. Sarah Chavez. Dr. Chavez is the Director of IVD and Scientific Writing Services at Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in Biochemistry and a PhD in Molecular and Cellular Biology. With 25 years of laboratory bench experience and has taught the university level for over 20 years. She has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment as well as for several large textbook publishers. Sarah's strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing allow her to assist companies with IVDR and SLR readiness as part of the Criterion Edge team. Go ahead, next slide, Sarah. Now I'm going to hand this back to Sarah and Sarai, who will get you into the meat of the content that you've come here for today.
Yes, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Chavez. I work closely with Sarai and the rest of our pharma team. And we thought in today's webinar, we really wanted to dive into how pharmaceutical companies can really get the most bang for their buck when they go about the process of enlisting us to help with an SLR. We all know that there's a regulatory requirement for SLR in certain instances, but I'd like us to all think about the SLR as more of a project or like a product. It's not like a standalone report. It's more of a tool that you and the rest of your team can use to not only support those regulatory requirements, but also to take it a step further and start using it to inform your internal decision-making and improve your competitive positioning. So we are going to use some real-world pharmaceutical-focused examples today to discuss how and when these companies decided to use an SLR, and also bring in some ideas around when it's necessary or when it's more relevant to bring in an external partner like Criterion Edge. So our learning objectives today are really to understand where SLRs are positioned in the strategy of pharmaceutical and also in combination device development. to discuss how to design an SLR that serves both these commercial goals as well as the regulatory requirements. And then mentioning when to bring in the experts. When and how do you know that you need help? So I'd like to start at the beginning with just a basic definition of what SLR is. From a definition standpoint, SLR refers to a clear, methodologically sound plan for the identification, retrieval, selection, appraisal, and weighting of published data. Many of us have seen these Prisma tables in our documents and have read or sought out systematic reviews during the course of drug design and development. It's sort of a standard practice in the research community, but it's often tricky to kind of think about it from a new perspective. Once you have a device or a product on the market, what else can you do with these SLRs? When and how do you know that you even need one? So taking a step back to the actual process, when we're undergoing an SLR, we want to clearly define our question. And often that's really why the SLR starts in the first place. Whatever searching or methodology you've used in the past is not necessarily giving you all of the information you need. In many cases, that could even be information related to your comparators or your competitors, to understand the current state of the art, to understand how guidelines may have changed in recent years, and to really see where you are seated within that competitive landscape. So I usually start this scoping process for an SLR by having a long list of questions that we ask. We try to pull a lot of the information out of the various documents that we receive, all of the technical documents, with the goal of developing these PICO terms where we have the population, indication, comparators, and outcomes. We also have a really clear discussion around time frame, and that really speaks to how long your particular drug has been on the market. If there is a very limited time frame, there's no need to necessarily search, 20 years back. And in a typical state of the art, we usually refer to the most recent 5-year time frame. But if you have more of a product that's been around for quite a while, you may want to extend it back longer than 5 years. Perhaps the guidelines really haven't updated for the past 5 years. It's a relatively stable market. Those are all the conversations we have up front. And then we decide as a team what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria that are most well suited to your literature review and the outcomes that you're attempting to retrieve. That's really built around your intended purpose and that target population and any limitations that there may be, or reasons to exclude a particular patient population from using your therapeutic. And then ultimately what we want to do is come up with a list of discrete objectives. What are some data points that we can collect that can be used to assess where your pharmaceutical fits in the broader scheme of things? We want to see where you're positioned within that competitive landscape, and we want to see how well you perform. And ideally, we want to lay the groundwork for any potential benefits or unmet clinical needs that your particular pharmaceutical provides. So that's where, pulling in the guidelines, showing the state of the art and sort of the gaps in the current offerings, we want to show where you're seated. And so there are ultimately multiple searches that feed into this entire process. We do searches that are targeting that state of the art, that kind of background information. But then we also perform more precise, more targeted searches looking for your competitors and also looking for the subject pharmaceutical. So as we're working with clients, we sit down at first to really figure out what is the need. In some cases, the need is a clinical literature search. You want to see what information is out there. So in that case, really, we collaborate closely with our medical librarians and our literature review team, and we try to provide more guidance for your overall strategies and approach in a very data-driven manner. We are coming at it from a very objective standpoint. And we are able to pull in data from the sources that we've identified into these discrete tables and analyses that can inform your team, whether that's the marketing team, the R&D team, the regulatory team. We want something that's accessible for everyone and that they can all use for their own purposes. Sometimes this is a one-time search and review. For other clients, this is more part of their ongoing surveillance of published literature, and we can conduct these sort of peekaboo searches or these updated gap searches after that initial literature search has been conducted. So really the biggest time buy-in is developing that initial search protocol and really getting into the background. After that, these ongoing surveillance are really only going to pull in a little bit of literature from year over year. And you're really just looking for anything that may have changed over the years and really just documenting that you've searched for any of those potential changes. So all of these collaborations can contribute to pharmacovigilance literature reviews where we're looking for things like harms or hazards or adverse events. They also do that assessment of the current therapeutic landscape and identify if there are any new players on the market. We do competitive landscape literature reviews, and we also support post-market surveillance activities. But the ultimate goal is to support all of the strategic initiatives in addition to the regulatory requirements. So I think the main takeaway and the main reason why Sarai and I were speaking about this is that we find that it's often considered to be just checking a box, that an SLR is just part of what you do to prepare. And many companies don't really see this as that strategic asset that it really could be and should be for your team. This should be a data set that you can all use to make key decisions, whether it's deciding if you can expand your indications or determining if there are any new hazards that you need to be aware of and changes that need to be carried over. This should affect all team members. And so we really want to challenge people to think about what you could use, what that information could really be useful for. So some of the documents that we work on fairly regularly are the non-clinical study reports. We do a lot of scientific publications and white papers. The literature reviews can also support, for instance, the investigator brochure on the clinical side, as well as these clinical development plans. Once you get to submissions, they can help with new drug applications or investigational new drug applications. And then also in the post-market area, as we've mentioned, they can help with some of these post-market surveillance and also updates that may be required for the instructions for use. So in a lot of these cases, the information that we're gathering supports multiple documents. So it's not just often one feeder document that we're helping with. It's usually the information that we're gathering. We have to keep in mind all of these potential uses for that information. And if you design it with that in mind up front, it ensures that you're not repeating it and conducting multiple sort of literature reviews, each for a different purpose. We want to do something that's going to be overarching and universal and able to be used across all the different life cycle and across different teams within an organization. So we thought it would be helpful to do a couple of case studies, and that's where I am going to bring in Sarai because she has extensive experience working with our pharma clients, and she has come up with a couple of the different scenarios that have happened to us recently to really illustrate the role of the SLR and kind of how our team works together to pull this information in. So I will pass it off to Sarai.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thank you for the great introduction to the topic. So the clinical development plan is our first case study. We chose to highlight a company that we worked with that was working on a very unique immuno-oncology compound to treat acute myeloid leukemia. They requested this SLR to identify relevant evidence to evaluate the competitive market landscape, because obviously it's always good during development to have a clear idea of what your competition is doing and where they're heading. And this is a great way to do that. The SLR offers a great way to gain that kind of insight in a relatively short period of time at a relatively reasonable cost. So the SLR process involved taking market-based insights and using that to generate the questions for three separate searches. Using these market-based insights is always key because you have to start off with the end in mind. And we went straight to the market to see what we could draw from and work together with the company to generate the questions. Once we had run the searches, we then extracted the information related to treatment options, indications, and risks, and then compiled the data to address the original questions. This led to a significant update to the clinical development plan and market strategy. And this was purely based on the information that we gained from the SLR. Sarah, I don't know if you have anything to add, any further insights to add on this case?
Yes, I think a big part of what the SLR can give you, especially from that clinical development perspective, is understanding the types of data that are already out there and how people are measuring success for your competitors. Because the last thing you want to do is be collecting time points or data points or metrics that are not going to be comparable across different devices or different drugs or different options. So this really just helped us to assess what is the current standard of care, how well is it performing, and how do we define performance and safety.
Great points.
Okay, so we will move on to case study number 2, and we see a lot of these. So now we'll discuss the investigators' brochures.
Yes, that's true. This is the one of the bread and butter documents of pharma. So in this case, we the case study we selected in this case was a company that was developing an siRNA vaccine. Really innovative stuff, cutting edge, challenging the limits of what data is actually available. So they requested an SLR to identify the current clinical burden of infection and then the existing options for prevention and control so that they could compare and obviously highlight the benefits that their innovative product is bringing to the market. So during the SLR process, we first worked together with the client to develop the PICO terms. And that obviously required the client's knowledge. I mean, we obviously bring our own knowledge to the table, but it required the client's knowledge on the intended population. So moving forward from that, we then identified the current prevention methods and disease burden, which was then found to actually justify the presence of an unmet clinical need. And this identification also changes the regulatory pathway that the company could use to to get their vaccine onto the market. This SLR was included in the investigator's brochure, and it was very helpful in highlighting the fact that the company in question was really looking at the absolute cutting edge information, the most up-to-date information they could. And once again, as an outcome, there was a lot more regulatory pathway clarity. It aided the company in getting their regulatory documents in front of the right eyes. And of course, it was much more efficient, but identified the presence of this unmet clinical need that ultimately benefits patients. And that's obviously what we're out here trying to do. Sarah, anything else that you'd like to add to this?
No, I think a lot of the investigator brochure, I find either it's too skewed towards marketing claims or it's too dry and it's just presenting the data. The goal is to be both. You want to be able to support those claims that you're making with well-designed searches that have identified data in a very clear way. And ideally, if you can lay out the argument that there is this unmet clinical need that your pharmaceutical provides, that's the best marketing you can get. So what we find is that there's often that distinction between like what is a marketing claim and can that claim be supported by available clinical data. Having a resource like an SLR and the data set that's provided by an SLR can really help you justify the claims that you're making and support them in a clear way.
Absolutely agree with that.
Okay, and then here is the next case study where we are going to be looking at PMA and 510(k) submissions, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with.
Mm. This one was an interesting one because a pharmaceutical company reached out to us and they wanted to run an SLR to support the application of a novel companion diagnostic. So that's now in vitro diagnostics to predict the response to the therapy that they were developing concurrently. So during the SLR process, we once again worked closely with the company to select the appropriate Picoterms and once again draw on their knowledge of their intended population. And then we extracted data related to biomarkers of therapeutic response to establish the scientific validity of the companion diagnostic. And this then fed directly into the drafting of the PMA to once again reflect the fact that this company wanted to be getting to the absolute cutting edge data and knowledge to support the use of this companion diagnostic for predicting patient response. PMAs are obviously, they're beasts unto themselves, but having the ability to update this PMA and further strengthen the position of the company in terms of how well they were able to predict the response to their treatment was heavily based on the SLR data. Sarah, you worked on this as well. What did you think?
I think the main thing I learned from this was that need for coordination between the two efforts, because the pharma partner is looking at it from a how do I know that I'm assigned, how can I justify the patients who I'm putting on this therapeutic? Whereas the IVD company is coming at it from the perspective of how accurate am I in predicting response? And am I even looking at the right markers of response? How do I define response from more of that molecular level? So it was really interesting to see how their two different kind of purpose for doing the SLR can really overlap. And, coordinating the information that was gathered through the SLR, there were certain pieces of data that the pharma partner was much more interested in, or the IVD partner, but it provided this collective data set that was very well aligned between the two processes. And it really did help them with sort of moving that companion diagnostic application forward.
Thanks for that input.
So I think, as we're talking about this, it always comes down to how do you know when it's time to ask for help? I was just on a call earlier with some clients who were saying, a big part of their company's strategic plan is figuring out why, if we have all these scientists on staff, why don't we just ask them to do the SLR? Why do we need help? And a big part of it is that the SLR process is quite time consuming and it's quite niche in the scheme of things. We are looking at developing very targeted methodologies and language. It's not just Googling the name of your drug and hoping you get hits. It's a very strategic process. And if you are not as familiar with how to design these methodologies, depending on what type of therapeutic, it could be feast or famine with the results that you get out of these SLRs. I've seen some where they've attempted it on their own and they've gotten 3 hits, and some where they've gotten 30,000 hits. It's really the goal of these searches, though, to really drill down to the information that's of the most importance to you, to find those high quality pieces of information. And to be able to document that process takes a lot of time. So we really work closely with our partners to help them build a process that's going to support them across the life cycle of the device. We don't want something that's going to be good enough to get you onto the market and then you'll worry about the rest later. We want something that's going to grow and move along with you, but also could be sort of that strategic asset for other teams like marketing or R&D. A lot of these SLRs have helped us to identify kind of where the field seems to be heading so that the companies can make those adjustments accordingly. So we really pride ourselves in that flexibility and the ability to kind of scale up and meet the needs of your team, especially if you're working on a really tight time frame or on a really tight budget. We definitely try to work with all sorts of projects in that respect. So as you're going about the process of developing an SLR to support your pharma applications, scoping is key. That's where we pull in both myself and Sarai or our other team members, anyone who we feel could help us with identifying those subject matter experts, those individuals who are going to help us really identify what are the key pieces of information we want to wind up with in the end. And then working closely with some of our other team members to develop really solid templates that are going to help you organize all of this information, because some of these SLRs can give you just massive amounts of data that you could be mining for any number of purposes. Often after this SLR is completed, you may notice that there's an opportunity for a white paper or a review article or something that could be garnered out of all of this information. You may start to see trends that maybe haven't really been discussed in the literature. So often these documents, we're working on one template and it kind of spins off into some other potential projects down the line. But we do pride ourselves on our review process. We undergo multiple rounds of review just to ensure that everything is going smoothly and sticking to those timelines. We really try to be careful about not letting it get away from you, because that's often where, when we get looped into these processes, we've found that the clients have been attempting the SLR on their own and they just get bogged down, because this is not part of your daily job description often. This is being added on in addition to doing your day job. You're supposed to find time to do this really time-intensive SLR. So time can creep up on you. So, in the process, we really help to make sure that, what you wind up with in the end is something that multiple team members can use and that you're all happy with it, but that also you can be looking ahead as to, okay, what could be happening in the future? Where is the state of the art moving? What are the trends that we're seeing? And that may help you identify some other, sort of strategic opportunities in the market. So just a few final thoughts before we move into the Q&A portion. Try to look for those efficiencies. Don't think about the SLR as what I need. Think about it as what the product needs, what the pharmaceutical need. Because if you consider not only what do I need now, but what I might need in the future and what multiple team members need, you can get a lot of really solid information out of this. I also encourage people, think about types or classes of devices, anywhere where you can build efficiencies. If you have multiple therapeutics all treating one particular disease, there's ways that you can design the SOTA search to support multiple families of therapeutics at the same time. So, we ultimately want to design a report that's going to give you a good snapshot of what are the most clinically relevant safety and performance objectives in the context of your pharmaceutical. But we also want to keep in mind, that sort of maturity of the technology and where everything is headed, so that we can always stay on the forefront of that information. Okay, so I believe now we're going to move into the Q&A portion, so I can hand it back to Mark.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. So we're going to move into our questions for today. We're going to start with questions that were submitted with registrations, but we'll attempt to take any questions that you submit later in the webinar. So please submit them to the Q&A button in the Zoom webinar controls that you see at the bottom of your screen. And of course, if you have any issues finding this or with anything else in the webinar, just chat us and we can try to help you. With that, Sarah, let's go to our first question. So are there any differences between SLR for medical device and IVD versus pharma? Anything we should pay specific attention to?
Well, I can speak to it first, and then I will pass it off to Sarai for any of her feelings. I know in my experience, the process itself starts very similarly. That scoping is key. We want to find all of the information that we need to really drill down on the search and get it tight so that you don't have a massive number of unrelated or off-topic articles to sift through. The main difference I'm finding is kind of the purpose or the use of the SLR. It often feels a little less formal for pharma partners because they are using it for often that investigator brochure or supporting some of their clinical study planning and things. So often there's a lot more specific ask for a pharma partner. I think the key is knowing kind of what information do you want to gather and can you gather multiple pieces of information at once so that you're not repeating an SLR, in 3 months when you need another document prepared. And Sarai, did you have anything else to add? Have you encountered any major differences between our partners?
I think it's a really interesting question because when we start from the perspective of medical devices and in vitro devices, we're usually they start from a background, their development usually starts off with a lot more engineering and laboratory work. And those are people who are, experts in those areas and will often have access to a lot more specialized data because I mean, some of these people have obviously been working on the underlying technology for many, many years in an academic context and will come in with a lot of data on that side. So we are almost pulled in at the clinical stage of the process when they're now ready I mean, they've proven that the underlying technology works and they're ready to take it to market. So they're coming to us for our clinical expertise and insights. Whereas with the pharma clients, I would say that it's throughout the entire development process. So they will often start from they'll start looking at data from the candidate stage, like right at the well, I mean that's not exactly the very beginning of development, but close to it, and right up through to their market surveillance activities. So I'd say the range in pharma is much more broad, but as you said, it's not. I think that the process for medical devices and IVDs is a lot more sort of strict and formalized and rigorous. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think it is a lot more versatile, and that's a really good point with the preclinical data. Often that's excluded from the medical device and the IVD searches as one of our exclusion criteria, whereas the preclinical models are often very relevant to our pharma partners. So we do have to take a close look with pretty much every project and make sure that the exclusion inclusion criteria are all still appropriate and really make sure that we've got any of the filters that we're applying to these searches, whether it's time frame or inclusion of animal models, that all of that is appropriate and needed. We don't want to give you more than you need, but we also don't want to miss something important.
Exactly. Exactly.
All right, let's go to question 2 then. Thank you. What are the best tools to use for conducting systematic literature reviews and meta-analysis?
So yeah, this comes into sort of where Sarai and I meet together very early in the process. I took a screenshot just to show you the two places that we really start when we're helping clients kind of assess what is out there in the literature are Embase and PubMed or Medline. When you're looking at Embase, they have a really solid PICO building framework, and that's why we keep emphasizing this whole idea of PICO, knowing your intended purpose, knowing the population, the interventions, the comparators and your outcomes. But there's also some really helpful tools that they have around the drug or the disease and even certain devices. If you're trying to, talk about, having a companion diagnostic, or maybe you're a combination product with a medical device. That's where it gets tricky because we've had several clients who have had devices that there isn't a real close direct competitor. They're kind of positioned uniquely in the market. And so we have to start thinking about maybe there are aspects of this drug that are similar to like this other drug and this other thing. So we wind up having to kind of pull together multiple pieces of information to really show the positioning and show how it's meeting that unmet clinical need. And then, I find that when I'm using PubMed, The mesh terms are a little more confined as far as you have to know what you're looking for. So having a good list of some of those keywords and using some databases like Prospero or there's certain mesh finding tools, that's really where we want to make sure we're using the correct keywords. And then aligning your searches between the databases. We always search across both because they are not 100% overlapping. You will get searches if you use the exact query just translated into the M-tree versus the mesh terms, you'll get two separate sets of articles that will come back. So we always search across both, knowing that, we're going to get a more complete set of information by having that redundancy built in. But the key part is making sure that the strategies and the methodologies are aligned between the two databases, because sometimes the M-tree terms and the mesh terms are not 100% identical. So there are some really helpful tools like the query translator that we use when we work with our librarians to really drill in on this methodology. Okay.
All right, next question. Could you address how searches for established pharmaceutical should differ from a novel therapeutic?
Sarai, do you have any thoughts on this? I know we've worked with several novel therapeutics recently. It's challenging.
Yes, and that's the point, is that with the novel therapeutic, you are going into a new space. Sometimes these companies are creating that space. So there's no way that you can go in with the same expectations as, you know, when trying to release a new form of, let's just for argument's sake say a new compound that includes from paracetamol. Paracetamol is so well established that there are, I mean, I would almost say there's like a good whatever 60 70 years worth of data, and there the idea is combing through the data to hone in on what is relevant to the specific case, as in for the specific company and what they want to use it for. Whereas with novel therapeutics, you really sometimes have to get very creative. A specific case comes to mind in which a company was looking for, they wanted to also look for comparator products and explain, well, to substantiate why their product was different and innovative. And theirs was so innovative that it was actually hard to find. I mean, obviously for them it was borderline impossible to find the appropriate comparator products in the literature. But when they came to us, we were able to pull together these various fields of knowledge, because as we've said, we have medical specialists on our team. We have SLR specialists, we have librarians. So we were able to combine all of our talents to come up with a very robust SLR outcome for the client. But it's definitely not a walk in the park. And I would have to add, it's also not boring. It's
Yeah.
also not a boring challenge.
Yeah, I think for that particular client, I recall we started from the premise of what makes you novel, like where are the gaps? So we started with, the SOTA search was clearly defining the gaps. And then from those competitors, that's where it started to get tricky. So we started to look at the mechanics of the device itself. How was it delivered? How was that an improvement upon previous methods of delivery? How is the drug itself an upgrade compared to available drug technologies? So we kind of had to think about it as like the whole, but breaking it down into the individual components to start really drilling down into what do we compare this against, because it is so novel. But yeah, it was really exciting though, because I do think that in the end, it's almost like you're laying out your court case. You have to lay out that argument and walk the reviewers through the data that you've identified to really lay out your case and make it very clear that the methodology of the search is what brought you to that conclusion, that it was all done very objectively.
Yeah.
All right, next question. Do you have suggestions for how to use AI to facilitate this process?
Oh, yes. This one I'm just gonna dive right in. This one I'm just gonna dive right in. Obviously, Sarah, I'll ask for your thoughts at the end, but specifically with the SLR, the volume of data, obviously, let's put this in context. We are producing much more data than we've ever produced in humankind. In the history of humankind, we are producing a lot more scientific data, and the speed at which the volume of data is increasing continues to grow every day. I mean, I recently read an article that said the medical knowledge is doubling every month, and we're going to get to a point where it's going to be doubling every 2 weeks. So with SLR, one of the big challenges is that we will need to start to leverage the power of AI to pull that data from the internet. The key point in this process to remember, though, is that you can gather a lot of data, but not all of that data is going to be relevant. No matter how finely you try to tune the algorithms, you will still need a human being to sit down and evaluate the relevance of those findings. And the greater the volume data, the greater the data volumes become, the more critical it is that those people are experts in the field, because it is, I mean, I think that a lot of researchers and people involved in the pharmaceutical development pathway often end up with a bit of tunnel vision because they've been working on this one topic for so incredibly long, that it's often the trick is often not that they don't know what they're looking for. They know exactly what they're looking for, but they don't know how to differentiate what they're looking for from what is potentially out there, and the massive volumes of data that they have to go through. Which again is where I think that we excel at Criterion Edge, because we are not drawing just on one person's expertise, we're drawing on the expertise of an entire and well-trained team. So, Sarah, what do you think?
Yes, I totally agree. I don't think we're at the stage where AI can just do this for you. So if your goal is to, let ChatGPT do your homework, it's probably going to give you some kind of crazy results. But I do think that if used more like a scalpel than than a cleaver, I think there are some ways that we can leverage the power of AI once we start really giving it very precise prompts, and once we start, pulling together these databases of all of the SLR results and really drilling down to what's the most relevant to your therapeutic, your device, and your company's strategic plans. That's where I think AI is going to be really helpful, is kind of with that cleaning or making suggestions about how to, kind of frame the argument. But I think it still requires that human touch, because as of right now, the reviewers are still humans, and the argument needs to make logical sense to them. The information that you're providing, and especially when it comes to an investigator brochure, we've all read really badly written AI summaries. You don't want that in an investigator brochure. So I do think that we can't pass it off all to AI just yet. But I think we're definitely investigating and keeping an active eye on sort of ways that it can be used to improve the quality of the product.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Excellent. Before I go on to the next question, I just want to remind everyone that you can reach out to us at consults@criterionedge.com to schedule some time to talk with our specialists. We're available to chat with you about your current or upcoming project needs, or answer more confidential questions in a free consultation. And you can also book a link or a meeting using the link in the chat. With that, we'll go on to the next question. How do regulatory bodies evaluate the credibility and completeness of an SLR?
I can start with this one. In my experience, it needs to make sense. I spend a lot of our time translating the information in these kind of very dense, like coding language from the M-tree and the mesh terms, and having it translate over to the clients to explain how the search did what we say it's doing. And we have to approach it the same way with how the regulatory bodies are going to evaluate it. if you seem like you have designed a search to be so narrow that it conveniently missed articles or case reports that may potentially offer some hazard data, then that's going to be a red flag. Or if you're not properly including articles that may not have, sort of the best safety profile, we want to make sure that we have a very a clear process that can be followed along with by the average reviewer. So the proper choice of those mesh terms to make it feel like complete but not too broad. And then the choice of all of the inclusion and exclusion criteria and making sure it aligns with your intended purpose. That's usually where people get thrown off. They will have data, they may have a broad intended purpose, like saying that this device or this drug can be used to treat all cancer, whereas the data only supports it in one type of tumor. That's a problem. So we want to make sure that, the intended purpose and that all of the pieces are well supported by the data. So that's kind of how I approach it as I'm going into the SLR. I want to make sure that I'm capturing data relevant to all of the potential indications or the claims.
Yes, I think the only thing I have to add to that is to remind any participants and listeners that regulatory bodies are going to go in and check everything. They are not going to be glossing over the data because you submit. I mean, there have been sort of clients who have proposed that the volume of data is more than enough to impress a regulator. I mean, that's an absolute no. They are impressed by the quality of the data, the appropriateness of the data, and as Sarah so nicely put it, it must all make sense. It must support what you're doing. It must support what you have done and the work that you have done. But they will not be impressed by large volumes of data, and you will have to make sure that data is robust and reliable and accurate. And hence we caution against using LLMs, which are prone to hallucinations, to compile this type of data, because if you can imagine, obviously, if you submit any reference that is a hallucination and doesn't exist, it throws your entire development pathway into question and your credibility as a company. So it's very important to remember that this is a rigorous process, and that's why it's important to have the right partners in your corner.
Excellent. Well, it looks like we have time for one more question, so we'll take this one. How can we make SLRs as efficient as possible without compromising quality?
I approach the SLR more like a database. What are any piece of information? If you've done an SLR correctly, you should expect to learn something new from it. We're all experts in our collective fields, but a properly conducted SLR can give you some new pieces that you can draw from. Or it may help you think about your product in a different light. So I always approach it as sort of a fact-finding mission. And that's why I think it helps that we're coming at it from that objective perspective. Because we may think about it or ask questions in such a way that folks who have been doing this for 50 years may not have thought to go back to the drawing board and ask a more simple question. But often those are the pieces that the reviewers are looking for, or the pieces that you really want to highlight in the investigator brochure, kind of taking it back to the drawing board. How do you make the argument convincing to your audience? And how do you know which audiences are going to digest this information? So whenever we design these SLRs, I try to keep in mind that there are articles that are relevant to one audience, but not another. So I may use some of these articles to support the writing of the investigator brochure, and some that are more relevant to a clinical development plan. There's going to be different purposes for including these articles. So being very careful in documenting that as you go ensures that you're doing the process once, but you can potentially mine that process for multiple purposes down the line and ultimately develop a resource that everyone can benefit from, but it's also internally aligned so that you're all using the same resource and you're not reinventing the wheel every time you need to collect data.
Yeah, I want to say I almost feel like Sarah's been a little bit humble when she was explaining the search terms, because after working with her, I can tell you that the special sauce is in actually identifying and using the correct search terms. Making an SLR efficient, I think this is something that, we addressed this earlier in the talk, that many companies may ask, well, we have well-educated researchers on our team. I mean, surely they could do an SLR. But the magic really comes in from selecting appropriate search terms, and that is something that comes from, years of experience, and, trial and error and further education and that kind of thing. So I would say definitely getting into the details of what is a good search term and how do you construct good search terms to get the data that you want out of the SLR.
Yeah, often our clients are surprised. Like they go into it thinking, oh, there's no data out there. And then some of the articles that we can identify are really, it's all about how are they indexed? How are they hiding in the literature? You have to kind of know how to find it. But sometimes you don't know what you're even looking for until you really start drilling into the screening. And sometimes some of these performance objectives that you haven't even thought of, or safety concerns that you hadn't even considered, you can't search for it if you don't know what it is, but you can if you can design the methodology in an appropriate way. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Excellent.
I will pass it off to Mark.
Thanks, Sarah. So it looks like we've come to the end of our time today. Thank you, Sarah and Sarai, and all the participants for the excellent questions. We really appreciate those. We shared some links in the chat and will remain on the webinar for a few more minutes so you can access these. If you still have questions on the content we discussed today, or if you'd like to learn more about our services, you can schedule a free appointment with our specialists, or contact us at consult@criterionedge.com, or you can book a meeting at the link that was sent in the chat. This webinar was recorded and will be available soon to watch on our website and sent out to you in an email with the slides and all these announcements. When you exit the webinar, please take our short survey and let us know how you enjoyed today's talk and what other topics you would like to cover in the future. Thank you, everyone, for attending and for all your questions. We hope this presentation gave you more insight for your SLRs. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you next time.